see dead people.
M. Night Shyamalan is one of the most innovative but also polarizing filmmakers of his entire generation. He's primarily known as the guy who makes horror movies, the guy with the twist at the end, but also the guy who fell off, perhaps more infamously than any other mainstream director in this entire century. Early career comparisons to legends such as Steven Spielberg turned into ridicule, as Shyamalan's films seem to keep bombing one after the other. After his two biggest films to date, The Last Airbender and After Earth bombed, Shyamalan moved back to independent financing. He made The Visit for just $5 million of his own money, and it became an astounding success, making nearly $100 million at the box office. Using the same blueprint, he then released Split and Class to similar success. All of a sudden, it was starting to look like Shyamalan had rediscovered his footing. It's a career renaissance unlike anything we've seen this decade. Which only begs the question, where did he lose himself for those 10 years in the middle? How could one of the strongest voices in Hollywood completely lose his edge? In order to understand this, I think we must go back all the way to the beginning and take a look at exactly what constitutes an M. Night Shyamalan film. It's his horror, sure, it's the twist, but most of all, it's his spirituality, his use of the slightly extraordinary, the layers beneath the horror. So, what do I mean by the slightly extraordinary? We're all familiar with film logic. A bunch of highly trained astronauts discover an alien planet and enter the surface like they're going summer camping. A character in a horror film sees a literal demon appear when she turns off the lights, so she just keeps flicking them. All you have to do to get your ex to fall back in love with you is to hire a flash mob, and if that doesn't work, you can always restart her heart by injecting adrenaline directly into it. In real life, none of these things work quite as simple, but a movie is a place of magic. We come to suspend our disbelief, meaning that we consciously choose to ignore the impossibility of the things that we're seeing in order to enjoy them. A character in a Christopher Nolan film, for example, embraces the extraordinarity of their world pretty easily. Time inversion? Whoa. Which is fine. This isn't a film about genuine human emotion, it's about spectacle. Crashing planes and driving cars backwards and some plot I couldn't hear.
Ukrainians expecting a passenger. I've never seen a capsulation like this.
But Shyamalan's movies are the polar opposite. His characters are real people just like us. Most of them live in his home city of Philadelphia instead of some obscure American town. They visit the places that he does and are just as bewildered by the extraordinary as we are. In Unbreakable, David Dunn learns that he might be a real-life superhero, but instead of going all in at the beginning of the second act, it takes him the entirety of the film just to get used to the idea. And after he finally does, he takes actions that are extraordinary only in the slightest. By comparison, here's Tony Stark 30 minutes into Iron Man.
Yeah, I can fly.
Shyamalan has repeatedly stated that he's extremely interested in spirituality, but by spirituality he doesn't mean ghosts. Spirituality is, by textbook definition, the recognition of a feeling or sense or belief that there is something greater than oneself, something more to being human than sensory experience. In other words, it's belief in the extraordinary. David Dunn is just as mesmerized by his newfound abilities as Shyamalan would be, or the audience. He has to suspend his disbelief just as much as the audience. And it's actually this quality about his work that once earned Shyamalan the title of the next Spielberg. See, in his heyday, Spielberg was the king of the slightly extraordinary. It's what turned his movies into movie magic. Just like Shyamalan after him, Spielberg took the ordinary world and added an element of something extraordinary. A park full of live dinosaurs, an alien child left behind, the Ark of the Covenant, they all take place in an ordinary world that inhibits a hint of something extraordinary. You had to suspend your disbelief, but not by so much that it lifted you out of the real world and genuine human experience. Shyamalan calls it the world through the eyes of a child. He says that the best age to be is 10. It's the age that my movies spin around a little bit. That moment when you're giving up believing in things. When you know enough about the world, but everything is still magic and possible. That's also why most of these films feature children in significant roles. For Spielberg, it's Elliot in E.T., the Murphy kids in Jurassic Park. For Shyamalan, it's Haley Joel Osment in The Sixth Sense, the kids in Signs, and David Dunn's kid in Unbreakable, who is literally the one who makes David believe in the extraordinary. Spielberg has since pretty much abandoned this style in favor of more serious filmmaking, but not Shyamalan. The sensitivity of children, their sense of imagination, and their willingness to believe in the extraordinary are quintessential to Shyamalan's work. His protagonists might be adults, but they're all trying to make sense of something that only a child can, of the wonder of movie magic. So, the slightly extraordinary is what gives these films their magic. It has worked for Spielberg and it has worked for Shyamalan, but at times it also hasn't. If one is to argue that Shyamalan's filmography is defined by this sort of magic, then we can't just ignore the entire decade when all he did was release critically panned movies. What went wrong? I think that this entire thing essentially boils down to the importance of knowing your voice, especially when it's as strong as Shyamalan's. See, Shyamalan's style, while extremely impactful, only works when utilized in a specific context, the previously discussed ordinary. Only when stories take place in a world that is as mundane as ours is there potential for elements of them to become magical. In research for this video, I watched all of Shyamalan's films since he rose to prominence, and the patterns that emerge are interesting. The first conclusion that I have to draw is, I don't think Shyamalan has ever made a truly bad film. At least not purposely. Yes, not even The Happening or The Last Airbender. I know, hear me out. I'm not saying that The Last Airbender is an objectively great film. It's far from it. But looking at it through the lens of Shyamalan, it's actually quite easy to see what he was going for. His love for grounded reality and childlike wonder are all over the film. For better or worse, The Last Airbender is completely loyal to Shyamalan's style. He didn't drop the ball, so to speak. Not his own, anyway. But for The Last Airbender, his style was just utterly and completely unfit. See, when Steven Spielberg moved from an alien story set in a suburban neighborhood onto an epic set in the world of virtual reality where everything is possible, he understood that he had to change away from the point of view of a wondrous child. This world is so full of stuff that if you were to stop at wonder at all of it, we'd never make it out of the first act. So in order to get the story going, we have to do what we always do: suspend our disbelief. But when everything is extraordinary, nothing is. And when Shyamalan loses his touch with reality, he loses his magic. The Last Airbender doesn't work because Shyamalan steps into a world already overflowing with CGI and fantastic themes with the point of view of a filmmaker who's still driven by his belief in the slightly extraordinary. Take a look at this infamous scene from the film. The way how these men perform a full-on battle ritual just to summon a medium-sized rock is hilariously awkward. It would have probably been easier just to throw it with their bare hands. But if you look at it from Shyamalan's point of view, the scene begins to make a bit more sense. He's filming this scene using his own voice, like it's still David Dunn witnessing the impossible, a group of men literally bending our physical reality. Don't believe me? Shyamalan will tell you the same thing. Responding to the criticism received by The Last Airbender, Shyamalan says, "I bring as much integrity to the table as humanly possible. It must be a language thing. In terms of a particular accent, a storytelling accent, I can only see it this certain way and I don't know how to think of it in another language. I think these are exactly the visions that are in my head, so I don't know how to adjust it without being me." With this insight, the reputation of his mid-career works as unwatchable becomes utterly void. If you're willing to go into these movies in Shyamalan's terms, you might find yourself enjoying most, if not all of them. The Happening was critically panned upon its release and is now largely considered taboo viewing. But amongst the wave of hateful reviews, one who got the point emerged. In his review for the film, critic Roger Ebert stated, "I'll suspect I'll be in the minority in praising this film. It'll be described as empty, uneventful mendering, but for some, it'll wave a spell. It is a parable, yes, but it's also simply a story of these people and how their lives and existence have suddenly become problematic." That statement is true for the rest of Shyamalan's works as well. If you go in expecting a blockbuster about a deadly pandemic or a horror film, you'll of course come out sorely disappointed. But Shyamalan has never been interested in giving you either of those things. Despite his reputation, Shyamalan has never considered himself to be a horror filmmaker. I don't ever think I make horror movies. Ever. Horror has an almost sense that that's the destination. This is meant for us to come out on the other side with a belief system stronger for it. Shyamalan's voice is very prominent and heavily rooted in the real. His pacing is slow and cinematography extremely considered. Instead of ambiguous masters, he likes to shoot intimate close-ups that capture every nuance of human emotion. The more intimate he can get with a film, the better it turns out, and vice versa. The bigger his budgets become, the more muffled his artistic voice becomes. The difference between Shyamalan and his forefather Spielberg is their adaptability to the language at hand. When Spielberg tells a story, he tells it in the terms that he wants to be told. He knows that Schindler's List needs to be quiet and meditative, and Ready Player One explosively fun. But Shyamalan can't do that. He's always holding back because he's not comfortable in the world of the exceptional, only the world of the spiritual and the slightly extraordinary. And he wants nothing more than to play with that. He's willing to suspend his disbelief by just a little, but only if he can bring his audience with him.